Hi, I'm Mike DiGirolamo, a partner and producer with Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience on simpatico.tv. I'm hosting conversations with journalists, filmmakers, authors, entertainers, and other folks in the media on the Impact Media channel. If you're interested in the work that these professionals are doing, you came to the right place. If you work in the media and you'd like to be a guest, please reach out to me. I'm always looking for compelling creators to speak with about the work that they are doing. With that said, I'm glad you're here. Please sit back and enjoy the conversation. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Impact Media. Today, our guest is Benjamin Salka, otherwise known as Jamie. He is the co-founder and the CEO of Story Pirates, and he is the second story pirate we have had on the show. Which Story Pirates, as I explained earlier, is an education and media company that celebrates the words, ideas, and stories of kids. And under his leadership, Story Pirates has grown to a multi-award-winning media organization that produces one of the top podcasts for kids in the world with over 2 million downloads each month. So today he's going to share with us the story of how Story Pirates pivoted during the COVID-19 pandemic from contemplating to shutting down to actually growing this very large and popular kids and family podcast. So he's going to talk about the company culture, which benefits from the camaraderie, the ingenuity, and the creativity of its theater background from its diverse group of talented employees. And I'm so grateful that he wanted to speak with me today. So Jamie, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Hey, Mike, thanks so much for having me here. That was such a warm, wonderful intro. I almost want to cut the interview right here because I don't think we can how warm and wonderful that was. I'm doing, the world is crazy right now, but there's a lot at Story Pirates to celebrate, and I'm really proud of what we've built over the last 7 to 9 months in this pandemic, and grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about it.
And I just want to emphasize again, it really is a privilege to speak with you, and your company is really inspiring. And I just want to, set the context here for folks. For those of you who aren't familiar with Story Pirates, they take children's stories that these kids write and they perform them for them, and they launch this podcast, which actually does an audio version of it, and they do such a fantastic job. And they've had celebrity guest star on this, and they went from just contemplating at the beginning of this pandemic, like, where do we go from here, to building this incredible podcast and really moving the company forward. And Jamie, I didn't mean to hijack the introduction or the context there from you,
no,
but
great.
Can you kind of set the context of the history of where Story Pirates came from and what you were facing back in March?
Yeah, so Story Pirates, we started Story Pirates in 2004. It was a group of 12 improv comedians, most of whom had gone to Northwestern University. And we were doing this sketch comedy show based on stories that kids sent in to us that we turned into sketches and songs and performed for the kids who wrote them. And we were doing it in this tiny basement theater in a little bookshop in New York called the Drama Bookshop. The first season of Story Pirates, this theater show that we did, was co-produced by a then totally unknown Lin-Manuel Miranda and Tommy Kail, the director of Hamilton. And within a few years, we had branched out into doing performances in bigger theaters and venues around the country. It was just a few short years after we started the company that we were performing at the Kennedy Center for President Obama's inauguration, and eventually launched a national tour around the country and started a branch in Los Angeles. The heart and soul of Story Pirates has always been this relationship with our fan base, with these kids who send us stories. I think, we got a few hundred stories the first year that we did Story Pirates. This year, and each year for the last few years, we've gotten around 15,000 stories, a little over 1,000 stories a month that kids send into us. And we've really turned this whole thing into into a media company where we're producing a diverse array of media, from theater to, we have a publishing division that publishes books. Like you mentioned, we produce one of the top podcasts for kids. We have music videos and several albums with amazing guest stars like our old friend Lin-Manuel Miranda. And it's all based on the fact that we believe kids are creative geniuses, right? Kids send us their writing, their own stories, their words and ideas, and we try to give them to the best artists in the world. I mean, really top-notch A-list celebrity talent. And those artists, those professional artists, turn these kids' words and ideas into something amazing on the world stage. That's the idea behind Story Pirates.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, you were mentioning at the beginning in your intro that that we thought we might go under at the beginning of this pandemic, and I really did. I had a few days in the middle of March where I was thinking to myself, we have this big podcast, we have a series of books, but they don't bring in the revenue that sustains the company. That really comes from bread and butter programs that we do in hundreds of schools around the country, and in this national tour that visits large performing arts centers. That's where most of our funding comes from. And I couldn't imagine a world where schools would shut down and theaters would shut down, and we would have enough cash flow to get through another 3 or 4 months. And I just panicked. I was like, 15 years of building this company, and I think we're going to be gone before the end of 2020.
I mean, it's understandable to panic in that situation. And I think there's plenty of other media organizations just as large, if not larger than you, that felt the same way. So like, how did you overcome? What did you do? I know it's a huge question, but like, what was kind of like, how did you brick by brick just overcome that panic in that situation?
It was kind of amazing to be a part of it. It felt like, there's a lot of story pirates. The story pirates are, like I said, comedians, actors, musicians, designers, authors, and they're, and plus a core team of about 15 to 20 people that run the company. And there was just an enormous rally. There was, Story Pirates is made up of highly creative people, and people who really believe in the work that we're doing and the mission, the programming that we're bringing to kids and families in the world. And there was just this surge of creativity, of sort of ingenuity about how do we translate this. All of our distribution tools are stripped away, right? We can't go to schools, we can't travel the country and go to theaters. What are we going to do? And obviously we had the same tools to work with that everybody did. I mean, it was just a lot of Zoom. We were really lucky in that we have a large fan base for our podcast. And what happened is we started to, as we just threw a lot of stuff against the wall. We started a subscription service a few months before the pandemic. And so we had a little bit of architecture in place to be able to interact with our fan base in a direct way. Where they could subscribe to something we do, and then we give them content based on that. And so we had that in place, and we just started throwing content that we were, recording and filming in people's living rooms, in people's closets, while they were stuck at home during this quarantine. And it just worked. There was a real match between, as it turns out, what we're able to put out under a lot of constraints and what parents and kids need during this time. One thing that's really interesting about this pandemic is that it became really clear early on that there is a crisis in parenting and in education for kids. And what we came to realize pretty quickly is that we actually have a really meaningful thing to contribute, right? We have an incredibly engaging, really funny, really meaningful type of product that we're putting out into the world. And people have been especially receptive to it at this time when kids are missing community, they're missing being in person with their teachers. Something that sort of inherently, like Story Pirates, has social and emotional learning and engagement and meaning and play built into the foundation of it, has just translated really well over screens and on Zoom.
so it was kind of like this confluence of like the fact that, all of a sudden there was a need, even more so than there already was, for educational material that was entertaining for children, because now they can't even go to school. They have nothing to engage with. And so it was a confluence of that need, but also you guys utilizing the infrastructure of the subscriber model that you already had in place, and enough people wanted to subscribe in order to keep the business afloat. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Yeah, we'd actually, not thinking about the pandemic, obviously we couldn't even imagine it. This was back in November of 2019. We launched the Story Pirates Creator Club, which is our subscription service. And the idea behind it was that, we've had this podcast out in the world for about 3 years. It has a big and rapidly growing fan base, right? I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were getting 1 million downloads a month. By the last episode of our last season, which was over the summer, we're getting about 2 million downloads a month. And, we started to realize back in 2019 that we want to be able to connect with those fans more directly, to be able to offer programming to them that's customized and customizable. And we don't want to necessarily have to wait until our national tour visits their hometown, which can happen at most once a year, right? Like, we have programming that we've done in Los Angeles and New York in schools for a decade and a half. And having that amount of meaningful contact with kids and families in schools was a dream of ours. And we thought, let's create a subscription service so that we can be able to offer that without having to buy plane tickets and get hotels and rent Ubers in every city in the country, and even still only have a light touch. Maybe once a year we can visit each market. So we had sort of pre-thought about that before the pandemic, and the pandemic sort of supercharged the need for that kind of connection. So in some ways we had done inadvertent strategic planning for the pandemic right before it happened. And
we can talk a bit more about like how that growth ensued and what happened afterwards. I'm also interested to talk about some of the individual logistical challenges that you might have experienced, other than the fact that you all of a sudden all your tours are canceled and all your actors are thinking about what they're going to do for the next 6, 9, 10 months. What was the response like amongst your team, and how did people? Can you give us some examples about things that happened around the office where team members came together and made something happen on a timeline that seemed like previously undoable? Or can you share some examples?
Yeah, it was honestly, it's one of the most gratifying experiences I've had working at Story Pirates, which is something I've loved every day that I've gotten to work on it for 15 years. But the pandemic really highlighted something unique about the culture of our company. Story Pirates is made up primarily of improv comedians, and there's a yes and is the classic improv philosophy, right? You say yes to whatever your partner has given you, and then you build on it and go somewhere new with it. And that really served us well at a time when we really had no choice but to innovate under duress extremely rapidly. And we just went through a few month period, March, April, May, June, where we were trying so many things and nobody ever said no, ever. There were dozens and dozens of Story Pirates who sort of snapped into action and started creating programming, again, like I said, sometimes literally out of their closets, while their wife or their boyfriend or their girlfriend was on Zoom for their other job. And we just ended up putting out an enormous amount of meaningful content, and it's sort of evolved as we've gone. We've gotten more focused, right? The early days felt like trying anything, right? Anyone who has an idea, we're going to throw it up there and see if it works. And we put out a ton of stuff. And then over the summer, we threw a summer camp that, we partnered with Random House Children's Books, and we threw a summer camp where world-class New York Times bestselling children's authors stopped by each day of the camp, and Story Pirates interviewed them about their creative process, and we mailed their books to our fans who signed, registered for the camp. And we put we sort of went all in on that and put all of our eggs in that basket. It was just one of the most successful things we've done, both from a standpoint of bringing in some really badly needed revenue to the company to be able to subsist and keep the lights on, but also just in terms of the feedback we got from families and kids, with so many families saying, variations on, this is one of the most meaningful virtual experiences that my kid has had. It's been a really gratifying experience to see people on our team jump into action like that with so much creativity and so much commitment.
And I was going to ask you about, like, what were some of those ideas that stick? Before we go further, for those of you who aren't familiar with improv, improv is like, it's an open-ended theatrical format, basically, where there's no script, there's no written dialogue. Actors are just on stage and making up sketch comedy as they go. And it is one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life. I am a trained actor. I have an MFA in acting from a graduate acting program, and hands down, theater improv is the most difficult. Shakespeare is way easier compared to it.
I totally agree.
Yeah, so it's so interesting that your company is made up of improv actors. I can't think of a more like a company with more ingenuity or probably more comedy happening around the office than one with a troupe of improv actors. It must be really delightful to have that. But I want to ask you a bit about this camp, this virtual camp that you guys threw. I didn't mean to get off topic. I just want people to understand what theater improv is like. It's like Whose Line Is Anyway is a good example of that, so to speak. But tell us some more about this virtual camp. How did the idea come about? Can you give us some more specifics?
Yeah, it came about. It evolved out of programming that we're doing in the spring, right? In the spring, we were trying to, in some way, sort of mimic the types of programming that we have done live in theaters, in schools for the last decade and a half. And we started to realize that summer was actually a potentially really important thing to think through. And we spent a disproportionate amount of time in the spring focusing on what the summer might be like, because we realized that there was going to be this big, overwhelming need that kids and families were going to have. In a nutshell, everyone was stuck at home. Schools had been virtual to whatever extent they could sort of throw something up there. It's almost, in the same way that Story Pirates did. Everyone was just experimenting in the spring, including schools, about how to even deliver any content and any programming. But we started to realize that summer camps were going to close, and that a lot of families who typically send their kids away for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, were going to have their kids stuck at home. The parents were still going to be at work, and their teachers were not going to be providing Zoom instruction. There was just going to be an enormous amount of time for parents to fill where they needed to do Zoom meetings with their job, and they needed something really enriching that they could trust for their kids. And we thought we could fill in the gap. We certainly weren't alone in doing that. I think a lot of arts organizations figured out a niche for the summer, providing some sort of virtual summer camp programming. But we just we gave it a lot of thought. We figured out what had worked really well virtually over the spring, and how to refine it and make it better over the summer. And even as the summer was going on, we were surveying our camp families each week at the end of the week, and asking what was great, what was what needs improvement. And we were sort of able to iterate week over week. I think we did the camp for 10 weeks, and over the course of the summer, we just got the best feedback we've ever gotten on anything in 15 years. And it's honestly a company that gets a lot of positive feedback because of what we're putting out into the world. So it was really special.
Amazing. And I would like to just kind of ask you a bit about, like, when did you feel like you guys were really starting to turn the corner, where you thought, okay, actually this is gonna work out. Like, this is not like, this is doable. I mean, you always have a sense that things are doable, but when did it really start to really feel like things could move forward? And did you ever expect it to just have this rapid growth that happened thereafter?
totally unexpected. I mean, I think we'd hoped that there would be, we realized that there was potentially a big need for it and therefore an opportunity, but we knew almost the second we started marketing it. We put it on sale for our fans, and it was like an avalanche of people signing up for it. There was a wait list almost within the first 24 hours. We just knew right away that it was really, really big, and we actually had to work on ways to expand the capacity so more kids could join.
All right, I want to shift gears really quick to talk a bit about the podcast, because you mentioned that you guys had worked on it for 3 years and you amassed a considerable following. 1 million downloads a month is a lot. But then in the span of just mere months, you doubled that. What can you attribute to that? And when did you see that start to happen? And how was the trajectory of that? How did that proceed?
It was really cool. I don't think we did anything for it other than produce a podcast that we're really proud of. Obviously getting 1 million downloads a month, it's resonating with people. And we had felt that, for the last few years leading up to the pandemic. But what happened was that when the pandemic started, there was, this crisis in parenting that I'm talking about. It was and is really real. Parents are really grasping for activities to do with their kids at home that is meaningful. TV, like I have little kids, and I know for myself, our nanny isn't able to be here right now. Someone in her family has COVID, and so we don't have any support right now. The only thing, my wife has a job right now. She's on Zoom. I'm talking to you right now. The only thing we can do with our kids right now that's even safe is have them watch something on a screen. So I think a lot of parents really early on embraced that they would have to put their kids in front of screens for way longer than they felt comfortable with. And, I'm okay with it. I sort of have to be. It's much more important to me in that my daughters are safe than not. I mean, that's the choice I feel like I'm faced with. But we got a lot of press with people recommending, press in the New York Times and Washington Post, Today Show and Forbes, just an enormous amount of really respected outlets pointing to the Story Pirates podcast as non-screen time activity that you can do with your kids that they will love and you as a parent can feel good about. And that was a confluence of offering something that was, able to stand out at a time when people really, really needed it. And the market was much bigger than it's ever been because there are so many families all at the same time looking for something for their kids to do that they can feel good about.
And Jamie, we're kind of starting to approach the end of the interview here, but I want to make sure that we touch upon what are some advice or words of wisdom you would have for media organizations or really any organization that is struggling right now or has been struggling and is trying to hold on and not give up on their business? What kind of words of advice or wisdom do you have to offer?
Great question. I've reflected a lot on why I think we've been able to, find a lot of silver linings for Story Pirates in this period, and we've talked about a lot of them. But I think underneath all of that is the fact that we have always been really clear about what change we're looking to create in the world, right? Story Pirates is a mission-based media company, right? We first and foremost are trying to make the world a better place in a really specific way. We're looking to celebrate and lift up the voices of children. We're looking to create a world where kids feel more listened to, more respected, and where they're more invested in themselves as creators. We think it's the most important 21st century skill. And because we know that, we were able to, when the programming and all of the distribution channels were stripped away from us and we all of a sudden sort of couldn't put our products into the world in the same way, we still knew what we wanted to do, right? So then it just becomes a question of well, what tools do I have at my disposal now? And how can I use those tools to make the same kind of change, right? Like, I think where a lot of, it's easy to get stuck when you sort of fuse your mission and your programming into one thing. And it happens because they've usually been so tied. I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense, but basically, you can't get stuck on the way that you do your main thing. In a world where much more flexibility is required, the more important thing is what you're trying to accomplish. Like, what's the goal, right? Because then any tools can be used in service of that goal, and it creates the opportunity for flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're saying is completely clear. And, what I hear you trying to communicate here is that it's not so much the means by which you accomplish your mission; it's that you accomplish it, and adjusting to it. And the power of yes and is really the key to that. Sometimes and it's really helpful, to have that experience of doing it as a job, basically, and then all of a sudden pivoting to using that in the setup of your organization is something I think that a lot of people can learn from. And we're just, again, so grateful that you came on to talk with us about this. And if anyone hasn't checked out Story Pirates, or you haven't listened to the podcast, I highly recommend you do so. In my previous conversation with Amy Fiore, we gave you a lot of resources to check out, and I will post those to this episode wall as well, so that folks can take a look. The podcast is on Apple. It's on tons of different media platforms that you can Spotify. Yeah, and you can't miss it. It's very large. It's got lots of it's got a huge following. I highly recommend you take a look at it. Jamie, if you have a minute to just stick around and answer a couple more questions, we'd like to field some live questions if we could. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and close out the episode. So just sit tight. We'll be right back.
Sounds great. Thanks, Mike.